Hey everyone, it's Colin, how's it going? Mini retro consoles seem to be the latest trend in gaming right now. The NES Classic, Super NES Classic, and now the PlayStation Classic? So on September 18th, Sony just suddenly announced its own mini retro console based on the original PlayStation. It caught everyone by surprise. I mean, there was some conjecture that Sony might offer something like it, but there were no firm rumors. I mean, I think a lot of people thought of it kind of along the same lines of like the daydreaming about, well, what would Nintendo do after the Super NES Classic? Maybe an N64 Classic, or maybe a Game Boy Classic. And oh, hey, Sony might do a PlayStation Classic. Not necessarily taking those kinds of daydreaming, seriously, but suddenly there it is. It just showed up and now it's a thing. And after the announcement, as we started to dig into the specifications, things seemed really familiar about it. The PlayStation Classic console itself, styled after the original, but significantly smaller. It features an HDMI output. It uses original style controllers, and it has a selection of popular games from the time built in. Now, that already starts to sound an awful lot like the NES and Super NES Classic, but there are more similarities, and some of them other than just the packaging and appearance. For example, it includes 2 controllers in the box. It offers save states. There's no internet connectivity or official ability to add or change games. And even the name is familiar, and so are the marketing and product images. It really just kind of caught everyone by surprise, not just that this console exists, but the big thing that I was seeing was a lot of people saying it's just how unbecoming it is of Sony to have blatantly copied Nintendo. I mean, yeah, Sony has copied concepts before, like PlayStation Move, based on the Wii controller scheme, but generally Sony has always put its own kind of spin on things. But the PS Classic really is just like a straight-up copy. Now, there are a few things different, and some things that are also a bit curious and unknown at this point. First, we don't have the complete list of games. The console is going to be coming with 20 titles, but at launch they only named 5 of them. Ridge Racer Type 4, Jumping Flash, and Wild Arms, plus 2 that I'm most excited about, Final Fantasy VII and Tekken 3. I can't even begin to guess as to how much money I dropped at the arcade in the late 90s on Tekken 3. So it's going to be a pretty strong selection of games at launch, at least of the ones they announced. But what are those other 15? Well, there's a couple possibilities as to why they weren't announced. Some people are saying that, well, maybe they're all just going to be lesser known games and Sony's just trying to kind of bury that fact, right? Like Sony spent all the money on getting those few really big titles and it's just going to throw a bunch of other filler in there. Well, maybe, but I kind of doubt it. I think the more likely scenario as to what's going on is that they're simply still negotiating for the licensing on the games they want to include and just can't announce them yet. I mean, when you're going through negotiations on something like that, obviously Sony wants to pay the least amount of money in licensing as they can, and the publishers of the games want to get the most amount of money that they can. So if Sony were to say, oh yeah, we're including this particular title, even though they haven't finished negotiations yet, well, that actually tips the hand in favor of the publisher, because the publisher can say, well, yeah, but look at all of the demand that you've generated for your product because our title's going to be on it. Doesn't that mean you should give us more money? So Sony obviously is going to stay tight-lipped about what games they want to include and are trying to include without really kind of screwing up all the whole money business negotiation part of it. So I'm strongly in that camp of I think there are going to be quite a few more good, really popular titles included with this console, and Sony just can't name them yet. Now, the next point, second, the console comes with 2 original style controllers. Okay, that makes sense, and I wish they were the later DualShock variety, but that probably would have cost Sony more money. And besides, the original PlayStation didn't ship with the DualShock. That was a later advancement to that controller design. So, you know, from a trying to stay original type of mentality, yeah, okay, fine, the non-DualShock controllers make sense. But what's different with the PlayStation Classic is that those controllers actually connect through USB instead of a proprietary port. So there's definitely the possibility you can use those controllers with a different system or the other way around. I think it's going to be likely, in fact, that we'll see third-party adapters for the PlayStation Classic that'll let you use other controllers with them, like wireless controllers such as the DualShock 3. And that would actually be really nice because the DualShock 3, in terms of an ergonomics and like button layout kind of perspective, is pretty much the same thing as the original PlayStation controllers anyway. The evolution of the PlayStation controllers has not been very dramatic. So it wouldn't even really be all that out of place to get a third-party adapter to use like a DualShock 3 on that console, plus you'd get the benefit of wireless. I'm glad to see that Sony went USB in this case when they could have easily done something more proprietary. Third, the price of this console is higher than either of the consoles that Nintendo has released so far. An SNES Classic, for example, with 2 controllers is $80 US, but the PlayStation Classic is going to go for $100. Now, some people could say, well, that's just a major money grab on the part of Sony, right? They saw how Nintendo increased the price of the NES Classic to the Super NES Classic by $20. Well, hey, they can ratchet it up another $20 and they figure people will pay it. Maybe, but again, the more practical concerns are the ones that I'm more inclined to believe, and there are 2 of those practical concerns. It's really just because the cost, I think, of the PlayStation Classic is going to be higher. Like, it's going to cost them more to manufacture it. The first part is that actual physical build cost will be higher because they need to include more flash memory in the system. I think it goes without saying that the PlayStation Classic is going to be very similar internally to Nintendo's offerings, and that it's going to run on a simple system on a chip on top of like an embedded Linux OS, and the games are going to be played in emulation. And as a side note, I have absolutely no concerns about the quality of that emulation because original PlayStation game emulation has been a thing for literally decades now. There was software in the late 90s that you could use to play PlayStation games on regular PCs and Macs. Those 2 titles were called Virtual Game Station and Bleem. In fact, I did a video on it if you want to check that out. So the quality of PlayStation emulation has been really good for a long time. I have no concerns about it, but the big thing that's different about the PlayStation Classic is just how much storage you actually need. You look at the size of an 8-bit or 16-bit game title, we're talking kilobytes to maybe a couple of megabytes at most. You pack 20 or so games on a system like that, you still don't need a ton of storage. Even a half a gigabyte of flash memory on one of those consoles is going to be overkill. With the PlayStation Classic, however, they're going to need an order of magnitude more, quite possibly, simply because of how much storage each of those games takes up. In fact, the reason why the Final Fantasy series switched from Nintendo consoles to PlayStation was simply because Nintendo continued on with cartridges with the N64, whereas Sony's PlayStation used compact discs. And Square Enix and a bunch of other publishers, Squaresoft back then, wanted the additional flexibility for more storage. And that's what it gave them. I mean, Final Fantasy VII came across several compact discs. It wasn't even a single disc title. So you look at a game like that, and each disc holds 650 megabytes or so, and you're talking about 20 titles on this console, and Final Fantasy VII may not be the only multi-disc title that's getting included in the PlayStation Classic. Now we're talking about them needing to include gigabytes of flash storage in the console. Now, yeah, I know flash storage is relatively cheap these days, and it really wouldn't be a huge increase in cost for them to throw in like 16 gigs of flash or 32 gigs of flash, whatever they need to do to accommodate all that data. But at the same time, that is still an increase in manufacturing costs, and that has to get accounted for somewhere. The other part of it, though, I think may play an even bigger factor, again, comes back to that licensing. Sony's likely going to be going with a decent number of third-party titles on this system. I don't think they have that huge of a first-party back catalog that was incredibly popular that they want to dig into. I think they want to maybe go with a really good representative sample of what original PlayStation gaming was like. And a lot of those titles came from third-party publishers. So there's going to be a decent increase in licensing costs, especially if we're talking things like Final Fantasy VII and Tekken 3, well-known games, big publishers, they want to make a cut of money off of the PlayStation Classic as well. And, you know, like most companies will do, they'll just take those cost increases and pass them on to the consumers. So seeing that increase in price of 20 bucks, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a bummer to some people that it's now at that $100 price mark, but I think it's reasonable and understandable if you kind of take the context into account. Now, fourth and finally, perhaps the biggest thing that's different about the PS Classic from Nintendo's consoles is the pre-order situation. They went live right away after the announcement, which is very different. In the US, that was at GameStop and Best Buy. Now, perhaps the most interestingly, even at the time I'm filming this, several days later after that announcement and pre-orders went live, those pre-orders haven't sold out yet. Think about how fast pre-orders sold out on the NES and Super NES Classic editions, and every time they've gone back into stock, how quickly they've sold out again. The PlayStation Classic, pre-orders went live right away. They're still available. Now, the console actually ships on December 3rd, so there's a decent length of time between those pre-orders and the actual ship date. So I think it's possible that Sony simply wants to avoid the situation that Nintendo put itself in with really limited quantities. Now, of course, Nintendo likely did it intentionally, but Sony, I think, wants to take a different tack on this one. And so by doing the pre-orders so far in advance, it lets them better judge the number of consoles they need to manufacture so that they don't end up too short by the time those consoles hit store shelves, especially when it's going to be going live so close to the holiday shopping season. People are going to want to buy them, so they need to make sure that they're available. Now, there's another possibility to this, and it ties into some other sentiment that I'm also seeing online. And that's the question of, well, who's actually going to buy it? And what happens if nobody wants to buy it? Now, of course, they're going to sell some of these consoles. But the lack of a pre-order sellout could also be seen as a sign of a lack of demand. It raises the question of whether this is even the right product to launch. You think about like the 8-bit and 16-bit eras. They're kind of timeless, right? You recognize those games immediately, and they're still very playable even today, given the limited quality of their graphics, right? They just still hold up. People still love the way those games look and play and feel, not just from the nostalgia point of view, but it's kind of become its own category in gaming. I mean, we're seeing modern games coming out that have that 16-bit or 8-bit kind of feel to them. But what about the 32-bit era? Like the PlayStation and like the N64, which was mostly 32-bit games, even though the hardware was capable of a bit more. Well, that 32-bit era, it was a weird time for gaming, right? I mean, it was very innovative. We needed to make that push, but it was also kind of a bridge period as we went from 2D gaming into 3D gaming. It blew our minds at the time because it was new and it was fresh and it was a brand new way of playing games at home. It wasn't all just flat graphics, side scrolling with very two-dimensional, you know, sprites and very predictable kind of gameplay. It opened things up into open world maps and the ability for camera movements to spin around the action and all sorts of other really cool effects. But is there really that much nostalgia for that bridge period, right? I mean, to some, the quality may not hold up, because it'll be compared to modern 3D gaming, of which it's really just kind of the predecessor, right? It seems like with 8-bit, 16-bit, they just kind of ended at that 32-bit mark and kind of went into their own little time capsule and became their own thing and just stayed there. Whereas 32-bit era kicking off the whole 3D gaming at home kind of revolution, it's part of a lineage that continues to this day. So people may look at the relatively low quality textures and heavy pixelation and view them more as a limitation than as maybe like a charming aspect of the era in which those games were made. It really raises the question as to, is there a significant amount of nostalgia out there for that era of gaming, despite the fact that a lot of those games were very popular and are in some ways completely timeless. So on the flip side though, the PlayStation was incredibly popular in its own right. It had tons of really good games. And I'm not necessarily convinced that the Classic is going to gather dust on store shelves or anything. Is it going to have a different feel when playing it than, say, a Super NES Classic? Yeah, I think so. Even though the actual experience is going to be almost identical, and I'm really curious to see what a teardown of the PlayStation Classic looks like. I want to know what's inside. I'd be willing to bet the internal components are incredibly similar, if not identical, to what Nintendo has been using. But, you know, I think it's going to be one of those issues where we'll have answers to all of these questions, but it's just going to take some time. What I can tell you, though, is that personally, I'm really looking forward to getting mine. I got in on a pre-order. I've got a lot of fond memories of the original PlayStation, and I'm not going to let some, you know, aged-looking graphics necessarily take away the fun. Anyway, I'm curious as to what your thoughts are. Did you pre-order a PlayStation Classic? Are you interested in that console, or are you just going to give the whole thing a pass because maybe you don't think it has aged terribly well, or maybe they're not going to include all the games that you think they should include? Whatever, let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. Also, if you're interested in audio-only versions of these podcasts, they are available for Patreon supporters. Plain MP3 downloads plus RSS feed support throughout the podcast player of your choice, and they usually go live a few days before they show up on YouTube. It's a great way to support the channel. It's the official way to get non-YouTube versions of the podcast, and it helps me out, so just something worth considering if you're interested. Anyway, if you like this one, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp, and as always, thanks for watching.